Thank you all for joining us tonight. I wanted to get together a panel of experts, and I'm so honored for the people that we have on our panel tonight. We wanted to come to you all to discuss the issues that we're facing right now. We're facing unprecedented times with the global pandemic of COVID-19. And that's not just a US issue, that's a world issue. People have been impacted all around the world. And what it has done is to expose and lay bare a lot of the issues that have been underlying in this country and in this world that have gone unaddressed for so many decades, and in some cases, so many centuries. And on top of that, in the United States, we're seeing unprecedented protests against racial injustice in this country. People are upset, they are hurt, frustrated, heartbroken. And we're at a period of time where we can go back to the way things used to be, or we can move forward together, and this can be a great awakening. And so my prayer for this country and for this world is that we choose to move forward together and let this be an awakening. And so tonight I wanted to bring together our experts to talk about several different issues as it relates to the pandemic and to racial injustice. This is the first night in a series of panel discussions, and I hope that you all will join us each and every time, because we will have great panelists discussing everything from conflict analysis and resolution, social justice, the law, public health, everything, women and their roles in the movement. So I hope that you will join us in the upcoming series as well. So I would like to introduce our panelists. We have Aleks Nesic, Shontel Coletrane, T.Y. Okosun, Heather Wellman, and Cade Resnick. First, I would like to introduce Aleks Nesic. She will be discussing political violence. Aleks.
Oh, hi, I muted myself. Thank you. Are you doing any intros or should I just talk? You're muted.
You can introduce yourself.
Okay, sure. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sharmon, for making this possible and getting some of our old classmates back together to discuss this. I think it's perfect timing for us to contribute to this discussion. And my apologies, I'm on the phone because my computer decided to crash a minute right before this meeting started. So as things go these days, right? So like I said, I really appreciate your initiative to organize us, to mobilize us really as scholars and researchers and practitioners. We've been working in this field, studying all kinds of issues related to social, political, global issues, and the issues that we're discussing tonight are global and local at the same time. So I want to start with that sort of bigger picture, because we, right at the start of this year, 2020, as everyone will remember, it is one of those years to go down in history for some very unfortunate things. But also you mentioned opportunity and awareness. So I think that we get to have a hopeful note as well as we sort of deconstruct some of these problems. So my background is in conflict analysis and resolution. That's what my PhD is in, like many of you on the panel tonight. Further, my background is also in psychology and intercultural communication and education. I've been in the space of educating and training different audiences, from civilian university students to military and the State Department, on various issues that are present in the world. So how are conflicts forming, developing, ending, maintaining, around the world to how different political states use domestic issues to advance their agenda, to further destabilize other states, and then looking into communal psychosocial resilience mechanisms and how those form all around the world. So I've actually done a lot of research in many places. My personal background is that I come from the Balkans. I grew up at the time when the country Yugoslavia, that no longer exists, was falling apart. We had about 10, 12 years of civil war that was pretty brutal, and probably many of you may remember the 80s and the 90s in the Balkans. So with that background and understanding how people can be mobilized into violence, how they can also be mobilized into nonviolent movements, how they can be mobilized into supporting different political parties and so on. My most recent research, but also practice, has been in the space of how that violence forms. We're looking at, particularly right now, the events that have transpired since the COVID started all over the world, and then the murder of George Floyd, and the global solidarity for the movement. So it's very interesting to look at how a particular issue in one place, and United States is visible enough around the world to where people know what's going on and can take action and could demand answers. That's one of the participants texting me, sorry. How we can take a bigger look and understand that the particular social injustice issue that we're dealing with right now has actually mobilized not only our community in the United States or our communities in the United States, but globally. People have started to speak out. People have started to recognize the shared humanity of oppression, injustice, historical racism that has existed in this country and in many other places around the world. And somehow, I don't know if it's due to COVID and people being trapped in their homes and paying more attention to what's going on, or whether that was a conversation we had a few weeks ago with a different panel of scholars. And a colleague of mine said, well, I don't know how many people around the world would actually be paying attention to Black Lives Matter in the United States right now if they weren't on social media all the time because they're stuck at home. So it could be a fortunate data point in this global COVID situation that the movement has become so much more visible because people have been paying attention. But also because people have been paying attention, we're seeing global solidarity, which is an amazing thing to see and an amazing thing to be part of and to witness and to be able to work with and through that process. So I'm happy. I would like more of a conversation and discussion rather than just sitting here and lecturing on these, but on these issues. So I'll just turn it over to you or whoever is speaking next. And happy to answer any of the questions that anyone has. And again, thanks so much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Alex. And one of the things I would like to just add about political violence is that political violence oftentimes starts with violent rhetoric. When you can demean people verbally, then it's not a big leap to brutalizing their bodies. When you can dehumanize people with your words, that's how it starts. So thank you very much. Next, we would like to go to Shontel Bronte. Shontel, could you introduce yourself? And she's going to be talking about women in the movement.
Yes, hello, good evening. All right, so actually my name is Shontel Coletrane Bronte. It's such a mouthful for me, so either I use Shontel Coletrane or Shontel Bronte at this point. I'm going to go with Shontel Coletrane because it seems to be a familiar name for a lot of people. So anyhow, I'm a certified ADR, which is Alternative Dispute Resolution Consultant. It also goes by the name of mediation. I have a master's degree in conflict resolution and reconciliation, and I'm just beginning now my PhD program to have a actual curriculum and instruction for social science for preteens. I have been working as an IT specialist since 2012, and I'm here to share with you a little bit about my experience with race, social injustices, and privilege. So first, I'm still in shock over how America has handled the COVID-19 situation. Millions of Americans have lost their jobs, and over 1,000 people are dead because of this pandemic. As a part-time teacher in the public school system, I was personally affected by the school closures on March 13, 2020, and had been home with my 11-year-old daughter, assisting her with her digital learning. Her 5th grade graduation was a caravan through the parking lot. And if the pandemic wasn't enough, Breonna Taylor, a female EMT, was killed during a no-knock warrant on the evening schools were closed in my home state of Georgia. What a day, right? So now I'm more ready than ever to see some real change take place after witnessing the death of George Floyd and the numerous protests taking place across the United States and throughout the world. I'm ready to have some real police reform take place by seeing the chokehold banned, having no-knock warrants abolished, and a national program to track officers' conduct. I'm also more than ready to start seeing the practice of reconciliation through real integration of diversity and inclusion policy in places where it matters most. Unfortunately, from my observations and current reporting, it appears the D&I training approach used at companies failed to really have a long-lasting impact as hoped. As a woman in tech and leadership, I personally have had to sacrifice spending time with friends and foregone laughing with and going out with colleagues as a result of my work. It can be very isolating at times being the minority. This brings me to my main topic. I want to be a voice for women because I don't see enough women talking about being a housewife or a stay-at-home mom and have the aspect of having to transfer her skills into the workforce due to the economy or just her desire to make her own money. I also want to see where healing is needed in her relationships as husbands see their wives transition into actualized value in the labor market professionally. I want to be a voice for women who are seen as novices in higher yielding marketplaces of employment, being passed up for opportunities or passing up on opportunities herself. I don't know if people realize how often people like me has had to decide between taking care of my home, keeping it livable for other family members, or ensuring a child receives resources he or she needs to go to school is more important than chasing down that next promotion or starting her first sales business online. I know it takes a lot to juggle all the demands of being a mother, a wife, and equally participating member of society. So let's talk cultural reconciliation in women. I can't speak about everyone's experience, but my social injustice and privilege and race story has been one of a lot of social integration in actuality. It's pretty normal for me to say I've lived middle class all my life, which means I have lived with predominantly white persons the majority of my life. Don't get me wrong, by the time I entered middle school, there were at least a few of all the major nationalities in attendance. But even still, the implicit bias has always persisted, which affects opportunities for minorities like myself and allowed the continued knee to neck maneuver, which causes the continued death of Black men and women by police officers in the United States. So now, usually in my position as a teacher and a good girl, I wouldn't speak so much for fear of my financial stability being attacked, but that's already happened. So I now decided to go ahead and use my voice. We as a nation, we need to have more open and consistent dialogue and training around implicit bias. The actions from these bias happen so fast. One can only be prepared if fully engaged on the solution at all times. So where do we start? I propose we start with stereotypes. I know a thing or two about them. I was most definitely stereotyped growing up, being only one generation removed from Camden, New Jersey, which is statistically a really high crime poverty area. This is where my parents were raised. I wasn't even expected to graduate high school based on a few pieces of demographical information. It's funny, I'm not mad at anyone for my past upbringing because I'm living pretty well now, you know. Like I said, I am a newly accepted PhD student, set to complete my own personal curriculum and instruction for social science geared towards preteens in the United States. Who says that I can't be the right fit for bank management or that I can't fit the role of real estate manager as a Black person or a Black woman? I'm here as a voice to women who deserve dignity, who deserve love, and who deserve justice in the United States. Tell me again, why is Candace Owens gets more hate than love, especially from her own corner? Is it because she's Black? Or is it because she's a woman? Or is it because she's an educated Black woman? The more accomplishment she seems to have, the less acceptable she is to us. And she's running her speaking business just like any other politician would. So why? Anyway, getting back to the healing part. The amount of love that I have received in the past few years really has been incredible. I know I've been blessed as I progress in my place as the head of household, as many other women of color here are in America. It's been a major help to minority families, seeing more income come into homes through the head of the household. I can only hope to be a part of the continued initiative to improve the gender pay gap. Let's have a heart-to-heart about this in the future. Right now, we must focus on the memorial of George Floyd and what his death will ultimately mean for the improvement of race relations and other social injustices here in America. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Shontel. That was good. And everybody, people agree or disagree, but I think the point that we're at in this country is that it's so important for us to at least have a dialogue. And that's the thing that people have been so afraid of doing, is talking and listening to one another. So thank you for your input. So next we'll go to T.Y. Okosun. T.Y., could you introduce yourself? And he's going to talk about African-American contributions and conflict transformation.
All right. So I'm just going to focus on the stuff I want to talk about. I'm a professor at Northeastern, and that's good enough. You know, one of the things that I've always wondered about is the emphasization of African-American contribution in the United States and to the world. One of the reasons, I think, behind that kind of you know, knowledge or kind of education that's disseminated in society has to do with the choice that the United States or the first Europeans that came here to these lands made 400 years ago. And they had a choice between two things. They had a choice between moral goodness, and they had a choice of you know, violence. So they chose overwhelmingly violence, and that's very tough to say of our European American families, but they chose that. And the fact that they chose that and consistently continued that narrative for 400 years, culminating in George Floyd's death, shows this false narrative and de-emphasizing of educational content that tells white folks, European American brothers and sisters, that African Americans have really not contributed anything to this nation. Let me just mention a few of them, and then we can talk about just the implications of these contributions. So think about these Africans that were forcibly brought to the United States, okay? This is very serious. And I think we draw from Randall Robinson, who wrote a wonderful book in 2000. It's called the debt, what America owes to Black. And he points out that African Americans served this country for approximately 275 years. So that means 275 years of nonstop slavery, slave labor. And keep in mind, it's unpaid slave labor, contributing to building the wealth, the first major economic stance of this country. These are Black folks that did this. So in other words, their hands, their blood, their sweat, their pain, their misery, while enduring things like raping of their mothers, raping of their wives, raping of their sisters, raping of anything that belonged to them, their lives, their names, their anything, culture, whatever it was that they had left, were raped during this service to build wealth in this country. The point of that is that when you have such an amazing contribution and histories within the United States, just use a line to mention and then titillate Americans with things like Olaudah Equiano, or a line to talk about Harriet Tubman, or a line to talk about Martin Luther King, and exclude this amazing contribution that really gave wealth to America that most of our European American friends have taken control of and are holding as if it belongs to them alone. So that's an important type of experience there to make sure people understand this. Now, we as African Americans are not saying this because we want to, antagonize European Americans. That's not what we're doing. We're just telling them this is a plain fact, and this is the starting point from which we can start any kind of discussion about negotiations, reconciliation, and anything else. You're not going to have, conflict transformation if you don't recognize that something has tragically gone wrong and that you've persisted in that, choice for 400 years. Now, there are other contributions that I just want to mention. If you notice, and if you looked at your history, you'd notice that African Americans also fought in the Civil War. They overwhelmingly went into the Civil War. Thousands of them, more than 150,000 individuals, Buffalo Soldiers, right? And these guys were willing to fight and lay down their lives because they understood that if they did, that would guarantee them some kind of freedom and then self-determination. Well, that never really came because Jim Crow shortly after then followed. And so when you see people like Michelle Alexander screaming out, 2010, new Jim Crow, and then now 10 years later, a new edition of her new Jim Crow, this is what she's talking about, this legacy of refusal to acknowledge African-American contribution to the American experience. And then, of course, we have other contributions. People like Martin Luther King gave America the conscience that we have. Whatever moral goodness we have, Black folks have always brought that into the American experience, right? So this is an important dynamic of contribution that African Americans are actually the ones contributing conscience to the American experience. And that has not stopped. If you even look at contemporary kinds of scenarios, Black Lives Matter, African Americans, affirmative action, African Americans, just name it, African Americans, Mothers for the Movement, African Americans, whatever you think about in the American experience, African Americans are contributing without being arrogant, without saying, look at us, we're doing this to help the entire nation. So those elements of contribution, plus the kinds of services that African Americans gave to this country, their lives during the Second World War, the military, the Tuskegee Air Boys, and all of these amazing, efforts in science by those women who helped the computations at NASA to send these people off to space. All of these things are contributions that European American brothers and sisters want to refuse to acknowledge. So the starting point is acknowledging these things. And then the starting point is also knowing that if you're going to ever think about reconciliation with African Americans and Native Americans, of course, you're going to have to sit down with Michael Sandel, professor at Harvard, and ask the question, what is the right thing to do? You've got to ask the question. What is the right thing to do? You cannot lie about these contributions. You cannot lie about these pains. You cannot lie about what Michael Eric Dyson says, the tears we cannot stop. You cannot lie about all of that. And then, of course, what culminates into, Tamir Rice, name it, Micah Brown, you just keep going. The Fianda Castillo, the Breonna Taylor, just keep going. Ellis out there in Minnesota, and then George Brown, of course, Eric Garner. All of that is the denial of what African Americans have done for this country. So here's my conclusion. African Americans have done everything right for the United States. Everything right. Their blood and their sweat internalizes their citizenship even before most Europeans would even think of that, right? So they are deeply more citizens because of the pains of their labor and sweat on this land. And until our European American families understand that, then we're still going to be at an impasse in terms of thinking about, reconciliation, because you got to apologize to somebody, and women understand this more than anybody else. If you're battering a woman, you've got to do something about that before she would even understand you and accept you back, if she's ever going to accept you back. So the idea of us talking about reconciliation and healing is fine, but we have to ask our European American brothers and sisters to sit down, take a breath. Nobody ever died resting. Take a breath and then begin to think systematically about what went wrong and what is the right thing to do. It's very simple. And my prescriptions are 2 prescriptions. You've got to apologize. It might sound crazy to especially the extremists, the supremacists, those folks who really have anger and negation in them. But it's not really crazy. Apology is courage. Apology is character. Apology is honor. Apology is, sharing your humanity, accepting that you are human, and recognizing that you are going to do the right thing and be on the path of moral goodness. All right, that's what King wanted. That's what Malcolm X wanted. That's what Black Panthers always wanted. It's not that, you can't vilify all these guys. They wanted that. And now look at all the protests. Millions of people from across the world, even from South Africa, where apartheid broke people's backs for 350 years. All you got to do is reach up at Terre Blanche, But guess what? It ended because some white folks in South Africa were willing to think about reconciliation, right? And healing. And it's a tough journey for them, but they're working through it. Why can't we do that in the United States? So we begin with apology and we move on to, okay, I know African Americans will forgive, Native Americans will forgive. That's not, we know that. But you have to come out formally and make these apologies. Not just to Native Americans or African Americans, but to women. Remember all the suffrage systems, people fighting for their birth control rights, and there's women are still fighting 75 cents to $1, all of that. So there's so many things compounded within this violence, this 400 years of violence, that we need to have a platform for some kind of dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, T.Y. Next, we have Cade Resnick. Cade will be talking to us about the culture and psychology of behavior. So, Cade, can you introduce yourself first?
Sure. Thank you, Sharmon. And how's everybody doing tonight? Thank you for having me as we go through this. It's funny you have me going after T.Y. And T.Y., everything I'm going to say to you is probably going to question everything you just said. So it's going to be interesting. My background is psychology, very similar to that of Aleks, and we kind of went through our programs together, so we know each other well. And I work on systemic change. That's one of my areas. I'm a teacher by trade, I'm an educator, and I also work on leadership training. I'm the chief behavior analyst for a company called Effervescent Leadership, and we spend a lot of our time working with leaders and helping them change their companies from the inside out, using what's called transformational leadership. And it's interesting, TY, because I'm going to bring up a few things here that you just shared, and I'm going to share why everything you just said is, you said, you know, African Americans, and you used the term African Americans multiple times, and we keep using the term African Americans. With respect, sir, I'm African, born and raised, okay? So you talked about me, and you talked about European Americans. Part of the problem is that we have used the term African, Jew, Italian, Irish, every other terminology to remind people where they came from and remind people from where they should be so that we can separate them into groups. Now, when we talk about culture, when we talk about psychology, this is done on purpose. This is not a mistake. It's not done by mistake at all. It's done on purpose to keep people where they are and keep people where they belong. I was born and raised in South Africa. I'm very well vested in what is apartheid. Respectfully, TY, I would say to you, please go back and take a look at it, very much so, because apartheid truth versus apartheid perception is such an interesting conversation. Because where did apartheid come from in South Africa? America. And America has spent a long time separating people using psychology and using culture. So when Sharmon asked me to be part of this, and I said to her, yeah, I'll be happy to be part of it, but you know, my area is psychology and the people's psychology and how the people's psychology uses that to where we are. And Aleks was at the beginning, she said, you know, you're looking at social media and how social media creates what it does. It separates us. It diversifies us into what our beliefs are and what our beliefs are not. And so when we maintain what we are going through a human experience that is valid for many and invalid for others. And it's an argument of humanity versus human rights. It really is. And in the argument of humanity versus human rights, as we have this conversation, we need to find out what the truth is. And the only way we're going to do that is to get inside the system. We have to be willing to open the system. So we have to take away the labels. It's Aleks, it's TY, it's Shontel, it's your name. You're people. We're all people. And until we can all look at each other as people, taking away that label, taking away all the things that separate us, by saying you're African, by saying I'm African, it puts a label. I'm an African Jew, or I'm a person. Which one am I? And that's where we look at systemic change. So me coming and looking at the culture of things, the systemic change of things, if we want transformation as a people, we have to go into the system and work on the system to tease it apart and tease out the things, bring that honest conversation. I think, TY, you were the one saying we need that honest conversation. Love it. We need the honest conversation, but we also need to come with solutions. And if we can take the conversation away from what is your title? You're not an Arab American. You're not a Middle Eastern American. You're not a Jew. Gender is a different conversation. Sexuality is a different conversation, but they're who we are. They're part of who we are. We're people. So when people turn around and say, you know, what is your race? We put it on a form all the time. What is your race? I always put human, because that's what I am. I'm human. And that's, I think, one of the most important things. You know, there's anger on all sides, but we're not going to solve anger. And go back to the psychologist to me, we're not going to solve anger if we don't put it on the table and have that systemic conversation. And so as part of us here, and I'm assuming that, you know, the next phase here, Sharmon, as we get going, is questions and comments to put that conflict out there, put the topics out there, because what is culture is who we are. And Black people have a culture. White people have a culture. People in Florida have a culture. People in New York have a culture. They're still people. And if we can recognize their cultures, then we can even go further down. You know, Shontel, I don't know where you're located, but I think you said you're in South Florida, maybe. South Florida is very different than Orlando. You know, Sharmon, where you're living is very different in there. So our cultures need to kind of start to blend, or at least be respectful and understand each other's cultures. And, you know, I said at the beginning of doing a lot of leadership work, what happens is people enter a company, they're from outside the culture, and they come in and they want to blend with the culture. They want to be accepted. And that's one of the problems in companies, is people come in and they either buy into 100% of the culture, or they put on the outside. We have to learn how to create a harmonious environment. So, I'm going to leave my time for whatever's left, like Alex said, for her side, and let's get some questions and answers and comments as we can make it happen. And that way we can look to a brighter future that works with everybody as people. That's what I want to put on the table here.
Thank you, Cade. I appreciate it. I want to give TY an opportunity to engage some of the things that you said, because I think it's very interesting. But my question would be, as being an African and an American, would you ever put African American on your paperwork for demographics? And the reason why I ask you that is because inherently, when we have people that come to this country, regardless of what their background or their nationality or ethnicity is, if given the opportunity to choose, people choose white, whether they're Mexican, they're Puerto Rican, they're Colombian, they're Asian, from Japan or China. They choose white because people, whether they want to admit it or not, they know the inherent racism that's in this country and what would go along with choosing Black, or in your case, African American. So do you ever put African American?
Sorry, it took me a second to unmute myself. To your question, I actually check the box that says other, and I check all the boxes. And if it doesn't have Jewish, I put Jewish. I write Jewish in there. And then I put a little note. I started writing a little note in there, because being human, that's what I said when I was talking, being human is what my race is. And then, get the breakdown. Now I understand our cultural narrative, which is to get the data and get all those pieces, and we've got all these equal opportunity processes, and we've got all that. I understand that. And maybe I'm trying to make a martyr out of something that doesn't need to be martyred, but I think it really goes down to the conversation of psychology when you continue to remind somebody over and over again that you are African history, you are Jewish history, you are Arab history. It reminds them of where they came and reminds others to look at them differently. So it's another form of othering as well. So to answer your question simply, I check the box other and then check multiple comments.
I agree, we need to get to the point where we see each other as humans first instead of our color, because that's a social construct in a way. Our ethnicity, our nationality, that's a social construct, but we're not there yet. So I think how people identify and how people are identified makes a difference. But I'll let TY jump in. TY?
Before you let TY jump in, you said we're not there yet. When are we going to get there if we don't start?
Oh, we have to start. We have to start. But here's my thing. You shouldn't expect Black people to fix a problem that we didn't create. It's almost like expecting a domestic abuse victim to stop the abuse. We did not create this system. We did not create the construct. So it's not our responsibility to fix it. I think Black people want to be seen as just people and treated as just human. And that's what we're fighting for and what we're moving towards. But I think until we get to that point, we have to acknowledge where we currently are, where we've been and where we currently are before we can move forward.
Right. Go ahead, T.Y. or Alex.
Yeah, Cade, you are speaking from the point of view of somebody who's been spoiled by education and privilege and advantages and all of that. And that's good. We are all speaking from these points. The problem with those kinds of privileges is that we tend to use them to sustain our different epistemological advantages. Notice how you say, well, we are humans. Well, guess what? How many poor people in Bangladesh right now, or poor people in India, or any parts of those really disadvantaged corners of the world would be able to articulate what you are articulating here? So I think one of the fundamental reasons why we have to identify ourselves, is because Europeans created the identifications in the first place. Carolus Linnaeus back in the 1700s, Africans never saw themselves as Africanus, or whatever they were defined to be. Africans never saw themselves any other than just people. And South Africans, I mean, you can go to Raymond Datt and many others, Richard Leakey and all those researchers that down there in Olduvai Gorge, they concluded that at least all of humanity started out in Africa. So in a way, we are all Africans, but Europeans don't want to identify with the African contextualization of their human reality. You are willing as a South African to say, I'm African, all right? But Cade, that in South Africa, even after the apartheid, or just before apartheid ended and before Mandela took office, you know that a lot of white South Africans escaped from South Africa to the United States, to Europe, and so many other places, Australia, because they didn't want to be contextualized as being equal with other South Africans. You know that very well. So we are forced to use these terminologies because it surely identifies why George Floyd was killed. You and I in a vehicle may never be victims of police abuse, but if they come to that vehicle and they look at you and look at me, I may be the one to be brutalized, and it is because my skin complexion identifies me in their minds as the other. Generally, the other would be African, African American, whatever you want to call it, right? So, but you will never be immediately identified as African, all right, until you let them know these things. And those are the distinctive elements of our, postures when we say to European Americans, well, here we are, the definitions you've done, you've created have isolated and polarized us. So you're completely right in that, analysis, completely right. We have been polarized. Our humanity has been taken from us and ground through a crucible of violence. And so now we are all polarized as human beings and left in these little corners where we have to identify ourselves. And it is through this identification that we either have power or powerlessness. So I completely, I'm on your side, but I want to remind you as my colleague that, hey, we have privilege, and our privilege, helps us make identifications that a lot of humanity, billions of people out there, will not even dream of coming close to. That's my response.
Aleks, would you like to add to the conversation?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you very much. Cade brought up a concept that I think is important to continue to discuss, and TY, I appreciate you continuing that. And it's a worrisome concept for me as a fellow psychologist. So I'm going to try to sort of acknowledge and somewhat disagree with the science, the psychology, the science in explaining identity. And as good as it sounds to a lot of people, and to a rhetoric of universal human rights, we're all human beings, like TY said, it is impossible. And then also on top of that, scientifically impossible not to have an identity, not to have the history, not to have the memory. And I think you remember we were in the history and memory class, and how crucial it is. Now, this is not to say that we cannot advocate, because it's scientifically impossible for us to rally around a nebulous concept such as we're all one human race, when we know very well that every single person has a history where they come from. And this is very important for a healthy development of identity. So if you studied Erik Erikson, if you studied all the child psychologists, you understand that identity develops in stages. It develops through stories. If you're raising a child without a history, without a story, without a parents, without a grandparents, without where we came from, where we're going,
you're not really raising a human being. I mean, you can raise it with different stories, but you cannot erase that. Without that, over and over and over, science has proven that we don't have an identity. We then become animals like, an animal is not aware of its own identity. Only human beings are aware. And the reason why we're aware of our own identity is because we have stories, we have memories, we have others to reflect on. Now, the fact that identities have been polarized, absolutely. We have ethnic cleansing, we have genocide around polarization of identity, of Tutsis and Hutus who intermarried and then started slaughtering each other and each other's children. The same thing happened in my country, in the Balkans. We intermarried and then we slaughtered each other's families. How is that possible? How does that happen? So it's possible because you can weaponize identity, and we're seeing that weaponization of identity, absolutely. But I would really caution you from a scientific point of view, psychological point of view, that we cannot speak about people without their identity. Now, if this is a personal opinion, you are allowed to have it, but scientifically, our development, our psychological development is impossible without identity.
Alex, I think you misunderstood me. I didn't say ignore identity. That's important. You take a look at any bit of research, you're right. But as a psychological concept, what the powers that be continue to do is they remind TY, because he's black, or Shontel, because she's black, or Sharmon, you're African. That African is their history. You and I, just like TY said, can walk in somewhere. If neither of us open our mouths, we're white. That African is important. That Arab in front of the name is important. That is the identity others give to people based on their background to remind them of where they came. And by doing so, we maintain their status in a society.
Not necessarily. People have given themselves an identity before others have done that too.
Yes, there's a history behind all of that. And as long as you turn around to somebody and say, you are African American, and therefore I treat you like an African American, that our whole cultural concept has to be removed. If we are going to move forward into the 22nd century, because it's going to take more than 80 years to get us there, one of the things that has to drop off in this country, in England, Polish, England, you put all these names in front of people, they remind them from where they came. They remind them. So the cultural importance is there. But are you American or are you an other? And that's important.
So Cade, what you're asking us to do is to recognize that there is a group that is behind the naming. And that group, usurps global power to give people identification. And
Absolutely.
that group doesn't want to be identified. Because, I just give you a simple example. One of my friends, a European American guy, came to me and said, you African Americans, if you don't like the things that are happening here, why don't you just go back to Africa?
Right.
And I said to him, wow, well, why don't you, because you're causing so much mayhem on people's lives, why don't you go back to Europe to see if Europeans would even welcome you or accept you there? And he's like, well, no, I don't know. I'm not from, I said, yes, you are European. And you have to accept the identity of European American. And it doesn't matter what version of European, and I think, but what you are arguing, and I agree with Aleks completely in her analysis, so I understand the weaponization of identity, but Cade, you are also arguing, which is important, that the notion of identification or labeling is also a weapon, but it's done by people who have usurped total power, global power, internal powers of their different countries, but these are mostly European Americans because they're the ones who create names, third world, developing nations, name it. They have all these terminologies for everybody. Barbaric, in quotation, niggers. whatever they can do to dehumanize the other. So what you're saying is naming others or forcing them into little enclaves and polarized little, undeserving, unwanted communities is the idea of naming them and identifying them, right?
Correct.
Well, let me let Shontel jump in. Shontel, what do you want to add?
I definitely see where he's coming from. The very act of naming something and categorizing something could automatically be placing a prejudice against it. However, how are you supposed to ever protect and secure the people whom are, contributing members of society and obedient if you can't name and categorize them correctly into safe places? Did that make sense?
Yes, Alex, did you want to jump in?
I wanted to add something to this discussion that we're having around identity, and to remind and maybe introduce an anthropological piece to this. That in anthropology, and I think that this has pretty much become a method to understand people and communities. There's a term called EMIC, E-M-I-C. This means it is the way in which people see themselves. Right, so, okay, you see yourself as African-American Jew, awesome. Idic is another term that anthropologists use to describe how others see you, Cade. And this could be very different things, as you discussed.
Right.
But you cannot deny the existence of the imic, because it comes before the idic. It is when a child is born and it's given all the gifts and all the stories from grandparents and so on, and grows up to be, I'm a nomad from West Africa, and my father and my grandfather and so on, we were all nomads. There's a mental image of identity that forms masculinity, that forms beauty, that forms all these heroism and so on and so forth, the core entity of an identity. Now, to a white European colonizer, they could look like savages. They could look like terrorists to a lot of anti-terrorist activities right now in Niger, but no one sees them as poor suffering nomads who have no place to go because of development and globalization. If we are to move forward in having productive conversations around this, we have to acknowledge the internal view that people have, and then not force them to go into this universalized abstraction of humanity that is not, like TY pointed very clearly out. Go ask millions of people in Bangladesh how they feel and whether they feel like they're global citizens and they belong to one big global family. You and I can talk about that. We can talk about that, but not everyone can talk about that. And one more additional point that I wanted to make, something that TY said very early on. As someone who grew up in East Europe and saw America as the land of opportunity to go to, I think you're probably aware, but since we're having this conversation, is that history of African Americans, history of Black America isn't taught the way it should be taught abroad. It's not taught here too. I used to tell my students, how would you feel about America if every single history textbook that you read is written by an African American historian or a Native American historian? If the words start with the narrative of non-white communities, we don't get that history overseas either. We get nothing. Everything we learn starts when we come here. If we have history classes, who we get to interact with, how we get to understand the concept of what America is. And so it's always, when we talk about truth and reconciliation and moving forward, history plays a massive, versions of history, everyone's part of history. Because if you guys remember from our PhD program, if you remember Saeed Kaki from Kurdistan, he said in one of our classes, and I'll never forget this, because he's from Kurdistan and they've been oppressed by Saddam Hussein for many years. And he said, history is for victors, and memories is for the losers. And this is where if we are to really talk about what solutions we want to bring forward, and how do we write history textbooks, who gets to participate in the collective organization of history teachers and boards and so on and so forth, whose stories get put into the history books the next generations get to learn. And I look at the world and what's going on everywhere. History revisionism and revising history textbooks is a #1 tool by so many different countries. China is notoriously awesome about that. Russia, let's not even go there. Brilliant revising of history textbooks of their former Soviet Union republics. We have to acknowledge that there's a lot more, and if those stories and those histories are not acknowledged, then I don't think that we've got some pretty comprehensive and sustainable solutions. Sorry, I went on a rant there a little bit longer, but just wanted to get that point across. Thank you.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about identity and we've had a very intellectual conversation. But what I would like to do now is to break it down to the simplest form. In this day and age when we're dealing with a global pandemic that has really shown the fissures in our society, how it impacts women. Women are on the forefront as far as being the primary caretakers in our homes. We take care of our children, we take care of our elderly parents. We call them essential workers, but we know that women get paid less, particularly women of color. Also, in the midst of that, we are dealing with the racial injustice for the first time on a scale that I have not seen before, because it's not just here in America. We've seen people all across the world protesting against racial injustice. So what I would like to ask you all is, what is the way forward? What do you think is the way forward in very plain spoken, everyday language? What do we do from here? Because if we don't address it now, we are sitting on a ticking time bomb. We will be back here, but we will be back here with a new generation that is unwilling to turn the other cheek. This generation grew up in the midst of 9/11, the recession, exploding college debt, seeing Black people being killed on tape and still not getting justice. So they're not going to deal with it the same way that other generations have. So what is the way forward?
So here's something that I want to start this, so we're talking about way forward. And I really have come to the understanding that, first of all, African Americans or Africans, and then of course the idea of Eastern Europeans, or Western Europeans, or Asian Americans, or Latinx Americans, or any version of American, have no intention of disintegrating the United States. I think I'd like to make that point very important, because the narratives that are coming out of the administration is very troubling. And it seems like it's a narrative of violence all of the time. And we don't have that intention. I don't think any African American protesting out there is interested in disintegrating America. In fact, African Americans are the precursors of law and order. They were always law and order abiding from slave days up until this moment. So that needs to get out first. That's the first things that we need to understand if we're going to even get on the tables together. So that means that African Americans have always been ready to talk. Now, the second part of that is that Our European American brothers and sisters have always said they are listening, but for 400 years they have been pretending to listen to African Americans. And that's why you have had racist laws in systems, that's what we call systemic racism, that have pervaded for 400 years and ended up in the death of George Floyd. And it did because many of these guys, like sleeper cells, activated once they see a black person, know that there's no accountability for it. No accountability. This is the first time that there is a huge global movement to create this accountability. So where do we go? What do we do? What is the right thing to do? I have already suggested that the first thing that needs to happen is for our European African American brothers to start their own civil rights. They need to start teaching each other. African Americans don't have, we've done this. We've shown them what to do. We are the conscience of America. So European Americans need to start their own civil rights movement and start. That's the first thing they got to do. That's the only way that they're going to begin to come closer to even talking about, can we reconcile? Now, the interesting part of this is that their children, and I was very happy to see a lot of European American children out there, little kids, with signs, Black Lives Matter, all across America and across the globe, who are actually now activists for this dynamic change. So that's the very first thing. The second thing is the apology. I've been talking about this. Every time I say this, a lot of European Americans think, oh my God, these people are going to make us pay them trillions of dollars for all the stuff that we owe them. Well, apology is beyond that. Apology is actually recognizing that you have done something to hurt people for hundreds of years. Apology, I have maintained, is courage. So European Americans have to be courageous to come out and say, hey, we are sorry. To Native Americans first, to African Americans, to women, and to all other groups that have been brutalized under the systemic systems of racism. Once you do that, then you can start talking about changing all of these systemic laws. If you don't do that, it would be the same story all over again. And like I said, it might already have been a done deal that because people are unwilling to accept and recognize that they can be equal to others, they already are maneuvering. Fraternal order of police, the police system, which should not have such powers in the United States, have usurped total power. And they're now manipulating the system so that they can continue to exist. And we're even afraid that they would still continue business as usual. They're just winning right now, all the protesters. But to get to any kind of stance before we start talking reconciliation and conflict transformation, apologies, sincere apologies. No one is talking about reparations yet, just apologies. Do it sincerely, and then we can ask the question, where do we go from here?
Thank you, T.Y. So, Shontel, I just talked about how women are on the forefront of the global pandemic, but we're also on the forefront of marching and protesting, but yet our words and our lives are not really uplifted. And the example I would give of that is Brianna. She has not been uplifted like some of the men that have been brutally killed. So what's the way forward when dealing with racial justice and women in the movement? We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I definitely want to touch on the subject as far as how are women going to move forward in this movement, but I also want to address what T.Y. was saying about, oh, I forgot my thought there for a moment. Because I'm still looking at this word apology. I don't know for me, but apology isn't good enough. I don't want someone to just say they're sorry every time they do something mean to me, because they're going to keep just saying, all I have to do is say sorry. And that's not okay. I don't
know if the apology is absolution. apology is just the first step towards justice. It's not a step towards absolution. We want an apology first, an acknowledgement of the things that have been done wrong, and then we can move forward to fix it, to correct it, to amend it, to abolish it, tear it down, restart, whatever that path forward. But I think until we actually get an acknowledgement of the hurt and harm that has been done and still being done to this day, we can't move forward with just policies because there's no acknowledgement of what is being done right now today. So I don't think it's absolution.
No, it's not. And you're right. With the Breonna Taylor case, we definitely seen this woman's death like kind of just really be glazed over, only to see a man's death happen 2 weeks later and it become a national call. Thinking about, you know, Breonna's life, she was on her timeline, her Twitter, Facebook and things, and she spoke a lot about how she was always there for others, you know, and how who was there for her. And so like the way she lived her life was in that way. So it's hard to say that it's a surprise that in her death was glazed over. You know, now people are really noticing where she's not there anymore. I think people definitely have to take stock and recognize I needed this woman in this and this and that, and she's not there anymore and it's hurting me. And now I'm mad that she's gone. But what can I do to resolve that? What can I do to make that better? And I think in Breonna's case, it was she had taken on too many roles. Why couldn't she just be an EMT? No, she had to be the EMT. She had to be the driver. She had to be the caretaker. She had to be the deliverer. She had to be the one talking someone off the edge of a cliff. Then she had to go in and explain to someone how another person was feeling because they couldn't express their emotions. And so who was there for Breonna?
Yeah, well, I think, Shontel, you're telling a story that is so important about our mothers and our sisters, okay? So, and we are connected to that story. Though I don't think that Breonna's dad, Sandra Bland, who was hung in prison, I mean, I don't think these individuals are glossed over. It's just that African Americans have been enduring all of these. I mean, Tamir Rice, a little boy, just blown away. I mean, so the pain came to this you know, unbearable point when this officer, so-called officer, you know, a civil citizen police, puts his knee on a human being's neck with hands in his pocket and asphyxiated him in daylight for the whole world to see. You know, a daring, you know, adventure that says to the mayor of St. Paul, who's Black, you know, it says to the Attorney General of Minnesota, who's Black, and then it says to the Chief of Police of Minneapolis, who is Black, that I can do this to you, but for the positions you have. And you guys can't do a damn thing to me because I'm going to go free anyway. So the women's movement have been very powerful. Notice the Me Too movement was started by Black women, and everybody else jumped into it, right? Black Lives Matter was started by Black women, and then people jumped into it. So women are very powerful. You know, during the civil rights, they were also the catalyst and power of the movement itself. Look at what Harriet Tubman did as a mother and woman. So I think it's very important that we don't join the narrative of glossing over African-American women, but make sure that we kind of find a way to present the narratives better. Like for the South African situation, I don't join people to say, oh, Winnie Mandela, look at what she did to the little boy, Sampi, or whatever. You know, I don't join people in doing that. I just look at what Winnie Mandela did for the struggle, you know, and so many other, you know, Victoria Mpela, you know, so many other women out there. That's the way that narratives ought to be carried. So do you understand what I'm saying? I mean, so, yeah.
So, Cade, we have some comments from our viewers. Winona said forgiveness is deeper than an apology. And Elena said education is the way forward because nobody is born a racist. So, Cade, how do we move forward? Is an apology, do you think an apology is necessary as a South African man? Do you think that here in the United States, we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission similar to what happened in South Africa in order for us to move forward?
And it's a great question. I think that Shontel was sort of heading in the direction of, is an apology enough? Is an apology the right path? Truth and reconciliation is not an apology. It's a path to which we can find out what's going on. I think that in order for us to truly cultivate change, as we are supposed to be working towards change and be change agents, we need to know culturally, and you know, using the word that Alex brought up was emic. Yeah, we need to get into the culture and understand the culture, and we need to understand what's going on. The concept of education, and then if anybody wants to look at a lot of the work in education, education is always the key. What we're doing here is educating. That's a very easy word, is to say education is the path to success. We're sitting here having a dialogue now, and we're educating others and we're educating ourselves. I think we need to have meaningful education and purposeful education to actually make change happen. You know, when you take a child, and Alex brought it up, and I know that, you know, I pushed a few buttons, and, you know, we can get into psychology of it, but when you take a child and you have a brain to work with, what you put in that brain is what it soaks up. So if we put in hate, disgust, pain, anger, and all those things, it soaks up. Emotions, everything else soaks up. Education done properly, with allowing a child to ask questions, allowing a young adult to ask questions, allowing an adult to ask questions where they feel safe to do so, and growing with that, developing with that, and not just saying, it is because I said so, and not just saying, this is the way to do it. Or if you look at Facebook, this group of people did this, therefore they're wrong and our group is right. We've got to educate as a group. We've got to educate as a whole, and it goes back to my concept that we got to educate as people. And then what I'll leave my part with is there's a book. Now, I used this book after I read it. It's called Race, Class, and Gender in the United States. I believe everybody should read it. It's not an easy read. It's not a nice read. It's not a comfortable read. It's very much an educational read. But Race, Class, and Gender in the United States really gets down to the nitty-gritty. When we take a look at where these things started to change, you know, everybody was talking about how women make change happen. They do make change happen, and yet even women will tell you they have a tough time voting for a woman, because integrated in their own culture is the questioning whether other women can do it. And so education is the right answer, but not just education, purposeful, appropriate, and accurate education. And then to the other question, a true truth and reconciliation committee that's going to get down to the bottom of things and hold people accountable. That's what I would say.
Thank you. And Alex, I wanted to come to you to ask you about political rhetoric. I know this is a tough question to end on because it is so in depth by itself, but how important is it that leaders speak responsibly? How important is it for people to be careful about the words that they use and how things are phrased and how we label other people, those social constructs, those identities? How important is that, and how do we move forward with leadership that engages in very irresponsible and violent rhetoric?
Okay, there's the microphone. Well, I think we all know the answer to that question. It is massively important to have leaders show the honesty, the empathy, the care, the love, the apology that we're talking about. People know and can see through BS, right? We all know and can see through a lot of political BS. Let's just put that out there. We know when, and from political leaders down to our neighbors or family members, we know when someone isn't using or is using violence enticing kind of words, unkind words, unloving words. We know them, we can recognize them. We're all capable to do that. They're dangerous. They're not where the society should be. They're not where leadership of a nation should be, of a community should be. Currently in our country, we have a lot of conundrums. We have a lot of opposing complexities going on. We have some leaders who are, we have our values as a nation: freedom, liberty, pursuit of justice and happiness, and so on and so forth, freedom of speech. But yet, I think it will be, we're having a whole other session on the freedom of speech and the line and the violence, right? But I'll just make it short. Of course it's important, and of course there are leaders, from locally elected leaders, and I think we all are leaders in some way to our families, to our children, to our community, should be mindful. Now, can we do anything about those who can't be, carry forward humanity and politeness? Well, we can, there are a lot of different mechanisms. One of them is voting. Another one is having a dialogue and a discussion. And so there are a number of practical things that could be done to deal with enticing rhetoric like that. And it's constantly being done all over the country and all over the world. So we just have a lot of work to do, a lot of focused work to do on so many different fronts. So
thank you, Aleks. Before we wrap up, TY said he wanted to suggest a book.
Okay, sorry. All right, there are two books I just want to share. And I think Cade was talking about race in America. So this is stuff that we've used for our sociology classes. And this is a book that came out 2016, I think. And you look at the subtitle there, The Definitive History of Racial Ideas in America. So this is Ibram Kendi. And this is one of those powerful books that has actually been put into video and audio with a colleague that actually is helping a lot of Americans understand how we got to this point in our history. Recently, 2019, this young man also produced a follow-up because he received so many questions about, how do we go about getting to the right thing? And so he produced a book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, right? And these are really important pieces of work. And so these would be, good starting places, good conversations for our audience to just at least grab them and start looking at and sincerely thinking about how to structure your participation in what we call, constructive apologies that we've been talking about. Yeah.
Yes, Aleks.
Sorry, since we're sharing books, of course I got a whole library in here. So I just ran over here and grabbed the classic. And I don't think this is necessarily for you guys, but it's for our audience, since I think Cade is right, we're educating on here. So this is the classic book and all the work done by Frantz Fanon. I think this is the first edition. It's from the 60s. If I can remember. Yeah, 67. I'm just gonna let you take a picture or write it down And you absolutely, I don't think we could have any kind of conversation really without understanding some of his fundamental philosophical, moral discussions about race issues. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you.
Yep.
I want to thank you all for joining us tonight in this discussion. It's not about agreement. It's not about having comfortable conversations. We need to learn how to listen even when we're uncomfortable, even when we disagree. If we're going to ever make our way forward together, we're going to have some uncomfortable conversations, and we're going to have to learn how to listen to one another. So I thank you all for joining us tonight. I thank my excellent panel. I thank you all for being the first ones to be on the panel. Shontel, T.Y., Aleks, and Cade, thank you so much for your participation. Thank you for your voice. Thank you for what you brought to the table and trying to educate all of us. So I really appreciate it, and I hope you all will join us for the next series that will be on June 20th, and I will be posting the information about the panelists and the topics they will be discussing during the June 20th second part of the series. So thank you all so much. I hope you have a good evening, and I will post the recording of this. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone. Great talk.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, this has been great.